You are listening to KUPR Low Power FM Radio, Placitas, New Mexico, 99.9 on your FM dial or streaming at KUPR.org. We are a community-based radio station for Placitas, New Mexico, Algodones, Bernalillo, and a little bit of Enchanted Hills, part of Rio Rancho, along with the Santa Ana, San Felipe, and Zia Pueblos. As a community-based radio station, we're a nonprofit, and everyone here is a volunteer. Right now it is 2 minutes after the hour of 8 o'clock here at KUPR, and I'm going to have my special guest here, Mr. Michael Sayer, and we're going to be talking to him in just a couple of moments. I want to let you know that the temperature's gotten to 44 degrees, so it's starting to warm up a little bit for our wonderful fall weather. We haven't quite got to winter, but we're going to get there shortly. Anyway, so today is my special guest is Mr. Michael Sayer. And good morning, Michael. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. And how are you doing, David?
Well, doing very, very well. And I certainly appreciate you coming down at this early hour of the morning. I get some guests that, you got to get there that hour of the morning. I said, well, you've got to get up sometime.
I'm an early riser. Comes with that Navy career, you know.
Okay. Well, let me just let you all know who Michael is. Michael is a retired U.S. Navy captain, surface warfare officer, and special duty cryptologic officer, recently retitled as cyber warfare officer, who has worked in the field as signals, intelligence, and information security, both in and out of our U.S. government for over 30 years. His presentation this weekend at the community library will include a brief summary of cyber trends, followed by tips for cyber safety for various age groups, ranging from older adults to children and their parents. That's one of me, and I'm also the older person. Anyhow, and also include some small business tips. A short description of the Department of Defense military exercise Eligible Receiver 97-1, referred to as the Cyber Awakening by high-level DoD, Department of Defense officials, will be included. Now, Michael, I was reading some of your background that you sent me, and that deal on that eligible receiver, that was very interesting reading, let me tell you.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that. Recently, a good portion of the exercise was declassified by the U.S. government, so we can talk about it.
Okay. Well, we might get into that a little bit later on during the show here this morning, and I know you'll go into it in much more depth at the library. But what is the purpose of your presentation then this weekend?
Well, I see some trends that are growing in the Internet in a variety of areas. First, it's becoming more commonplace to use the Internet in our daily life, and we'll talk more about how that's expanding both here and during the presentation. And some of those trends for me are alarming. This is after my years of experience. I'm seeing some things that I think are pretty important to think about. So the briefing is called Stop, Think, and Connect. It's done in conjunction with October being the month of cybersecurity awareness as declared by the Department of Homeland Security. We're a little past October, but the point is still valid. Really, it has to do with stop and think before you connect to the Internet. So the briefing is going to cover a little bit about evaluating your personal risk regarding cyber stuff. What are those risks, and what can you do to mitigate those risks? And risk-benefit trade-offs in using the Internet.
Okay, and as I alluded to a minute ago in my opening remarks earlier, is that, folks, you are at risk. You simply are. I mean, we hear it on the news all the time about attacks and possible attacks, like even during the campaign that just ended. Irrespective of the issue with the Internet or the emails, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the thoughts that Russia was trying to attack into the Democrats' websites. I'm sure they tried to do the Republicans. I'm sure everybody's, and whether it's them or anybody else, cyber attacks are a very big threat, and we need to be protected. And so why does somebody want to maybe get a hold of something I have. Who am I? I'm just Dave Earl out here doing a radio show.
Well, David, you talked about big stuff. We talk about big stuff that we hear in the news quite a bit, this big attack or that big attack, or maybe you hear about compromises of databases of big companies like Sony Entertainment, or in my personal case, the Office of Manpower and Budget, the OMB attack that occurred a couple of years ago, where data was stolen. Well, those things are the context of what I'd like to talk about, but I want to bring it home to the personal level, to the people of Placitas, Bernalillo, and all your listeners as to what all does this mean to them in their home as they use the internet or as they consider plugging in different devices.
Okay. I assume every piece of equipment is attackable. I mean, we all have different pieces of equipment. I mean, the cell phones, you name it, the iPads. You just saw I have 2 iPads running here this morning, plus my cell phone sitting right here. Is anything exempt from attack?
Well, I have a friend, his name is Paul. I won't disclose his full name, but my friend Paul has a theory that the only attackable, as it were, computer is the one that's in a hole 6 foot deep, buried and covered in concrete. That is a bit extreme, but I guess the reality is anything that's connected, anything that has a door could be vulnerable. And it's wise decisions that go along with connecting devices that I want to emphasize during my presentation on Saturday.
Okay. Now, what trends do you see in the internet, and how do they affect our listeners? And I know you had mentioned to me when we talked before about the Internet of Things and the Internet of People.
Sure. Well, Internet of Things, what does that mean? We're seeing nowadays, for the purposes of social convenience, more and more devices and things being connected to the internet. For example, automobiles nowadays. A lot of them you can press a button and talk to someone over the car phone, or the car is connected to the internet and you can do surfing from your car, web surfing, that sort of thing. That's one example. Other things are the appliances in your home. So let's say televisions, and you want to watch Netflix on your TV, so you plug your TV into an internet cable or turn it on for its Wi-Fi and connect that to your home Wi-Fi, and it's connected to the internet. DVD players, same thing. Those sorts of things are happening. And here's what's going to happen, if not now, tomorrow. Your refrigerator will be connected to the internet.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but you brought up an interesting point I saw on another story or news, talking about how, like, from your car, or whatever, say you can turn on your lights at home, or you can turn on a security system and everything. That's all vulnerable then, and it allows people an easier access to your personal data.
Picture the internet like your home with a number of doors in it. The more doors you have, the more opportunities for a bad person are available for a bad person to come, twist the doorknob, and try and open that door and come in. And that's what's happening with the internet. And you talked about linking security systems into the internet, or being able to view your cameras remotely, that sort of thing. More things that are connected, the more ways or opportunities bad guys can use that to their advantage. But, it begs the question, why would a bad guy want to attack you? A citizen in Placitas or Bernalillo or on the reservation? Why is that? And there's a number of reasons for that I'll cover during my presentation at the library.
Okay. All right. I guess, and again, not giving all your tips away from the program, but maybe we can talk about a few things like firewalls and so forth, ways to, let our listeners, because unfortunately, as much as I'd like everybody to be at the library, not everybody's going to make it. So we want to give a few tips today on how can people protect themselves, and what about these firewalls and so forth?
Sure. Well, first off, I haven't I was remiss in not thanking you for having me on the air this morning, but I also want to say thank you to Ann Gray Frost and the rest of the Placitas Community Library staff for hosting my presentation there. And I hope to do more presentations like this one at other places, perhaps in Albuquerque and the greater area. To answer your question, firewalls and all that. All that's very important. Firewalls are important. Good password protection is important. But the thing that needs to be remembered is that these applications need to be wisely used. Driving a car is important. Driving a car wisely is very important. And it's a similar analogy. And I'll again be covering some of the things that are important in that regard. Well, one example, for example, people say, well, I have antivirus protection. I'm protected. Yes, you are, to a certain extent. Have you kept that application up to date? Does it have the latest virus signatures in it? Have you run it lately? This is part of the wisdom in protecting yourself.
Is it, and I'm going to ask you, this is an idiot question of me. I just retired from my company of many, many years. And, of course, they had all the security system on my laptop and everything else that was theirs. I have a home computer. How can I go in and see what may or may not be on that? I don't know what's on my home computer as far as an antivirus or anything. Because it was set up by a friend a long time ago for me, about 4 years. That shows how old my computer is. But anyway, where can I find what kind of security systems might be in my computer? And I'm thinking of older people at home that are not, they had their kids set their computer up,
Oh, well, whether you run a Windows machine or a Mac, an Apple OS X machine, or a phone or Samsung Galaxy, don't run a Samsung Galaxy 7 and try and get on an airplane,
no.
by the way. But seriously, look at the applications on that system, whatever it happens to be, and look for your virus protection and firewall applications. There's a lot of advice out there on the internet on how to do that. If I need to come back and talk about that in more detail at a future date, we can do that.
All right.
But look for those. Make sure they're turned on. Make sure they're updated. Use them wisely.
Okay, now there's lots of brands, and I know you can't endorse any particular brand of firewalls or anything like that, but I assume there's a way to find out the reliability of some of these systems, like looking it up on the internet. I think like you can go look up cars and find out about a car, good,
Sure.
bad, or indifferent.
Sure. Just like shopping for anything else, like a vehicle or some place where you want to buy something, or Amazon.com for the best price on something. You can do the same thing for internet security and safety products. There are different magazines like PC Magazine or CNET, CNET, that regularly produce evaluations of one product against another, be it McAfee or Norton, or be it Zone Alarm or ClamXAV, whatever's out there. There are folks who are technically smart in evaluating them, and they also evaluate them from the aspect of ease of use for the average consumer. So factor all that in, make your choice. But do something.
Now it's 45 degrees, getting a little warmer. And as I said, our guest this morning is Michael Sayer, who has been involved with cybersecurity with the federal government. And when we were in our break there, we were talking about the fact that Placitas and Bernalillo area has a great many senior citizens. Michael, why don't you address that in cyber issues for them?
Sure, and I'm one of them.
Yes, so am I. I just retired, as I told you, from my company here the 30th of September, and so now this is what I do.
Well, I'm retired. I retired from the Navy after 26 years, and then I worked for AT&T on pretty big cybersecurity network issues for another 4 years or so before I retired and decided to retire here in the land of enchantment, and specifically chose Placitas.
And what? Where did you move from? I mean, the military kept you moving around, I assume, but did you have a home that you sort of your base?
Well, being in the military, both my wife and I were naval officers and both Navy cryptologists. We moved around quite a bit. So my real home was in Chicago, Illinois. That's where I grew up. and went to high school and college. But once I was out of college, I was in the Navy and off to see the world and stationed all over the place. To answer your question, we moved from the East Coast area, specifically Leesburg, Virginia, to here. That's where we ended up, the greater Washington, D.C. area where I was working last.
Well, being a native of Chicago, I know several listeners are listening this morning, and you talked to Elaine, I think, or had emails. They're native Chicagoites, so I'm sure they're thrilled to hear you're from Chicago.
Well, we talked about the Cubs, and we certainly talked about the rainstorm delay and all the details of that historic World Series that just passed. You mentioned senior citizens. Let's come back to that.
Yes.
We have a good percentage of the population are seniors here. And one of the important aspects of cybersecurity is protection of assets. And I think we would all agree that as seniors, we are interested in making sure that our retirement assets are protected just as much as we use wise investment decisions and so forth, and wise tax decisions in order to protect those investments. The same thing goes with the Internet. And now that our assets are online to a great extent, they should be protected too. And we'll be discussing those things at the library on Saturday.
Okay, and I I know you're going to give lots of tips on the safe internet use, and I'm thinking as I think about all of this, is there any particular? I'm trying to think of what the words I'm trying to use here. Any particular area of people that tend to try to attack your computers? I mean, is it just strictly criminal element or whatever? Is that what? Is that? I mean, I think of the guy that's hiding in Russia right now that worked for the NSA, and he divulged all that stuff. Now that really doesn't have anything to do per se with attacking, but it is still crooks doing things, I guess, the way I look at it.
Well, the way I look at this is sort of how a policeman or a investigator would look at it. The bad guy, does he have the motive, the opportunity, and the means? So really, when you talk about attacking someone personally, a citizen of Placitas, that's how I would look at the situation and try and get a sense of what it is. So what's the motive? Is it to get information? Is it a personal revenge? Someone who's been wronged? I think those things are in the minority, quite frankly. Rather, I think it's more likely that our citizens will be duped into giving away personal information on themselves that could be used against them later. That's my major concern.
Okay.
And we talked about this Internet of Things. As that expands, as we all start connecting our refrigerators and toasters to the Internet, and that's not as far-fetched as it seems, there are going to be more opportunities for bad guys to get that information and use it to exploit us and other people.
Well, and as you mentioned, of course, again, we've all talked about us all being senior citizens and all, but a good many of us, and we're vulnerable to those kinds of things. I mean, you read about them, you hear about them all the time in regular crime element, not just cyberspace, but how seniors are targeted by criminal element.
Let me address two things. You mentioned the tips that I'm going to be talking about. If you come to the library for the Saturday presentation at 2 p.m., I will have prepared handouts in various categories of tips about Internet use, and those handouts are divided up by age groups and different sort of topics. For example, there'll be tips across the board. There'll be a separate tip sheet about privacy and identity theft. Another one about how to use social media wisely. Tips specifically designed for older Americans and tips designed for teens and young adults, as well as children. Our children are using the Internet. I have a grandson that already knows how to use the iPad at the age of 4. He's flipping through screens, looking at things. Holy smokes, Also, there'll be tips for travelers, wise things to do when you're on the road, and finally, tips for small business. And those will all be handouts that people can take away. And if they want to talk about them further, we can do that. But that'll all be available at the library when you come on down.
You hit a very, very good point about kids. Your grandson is 4. My granddaughter is now 6, but she's been using computers for at least 2 years, if not longer. I never forget my daughter telling me how they would show her what movies and things she could watch and she knew exactly how to get there and get to it.
You bet.
And of course they had done, fortunately, and that's another, I guess, sort of maybe not really related to your topic, but parental control to protect your kid from going to the wrong way and getting into the wrong things, which I guess could lead to somebody getting access to your system if the kid got into the wrong websites.
David, that is spot on. Kids, well, there's a certain level of maturity that's required to use the internet wisely, and children need to be educated about that. Also, and unfortunately, there are child predators out there, and they are looking for opportunities to exploit our children, and we mustn't let that happen. I saw on a little, turning to a more humorous side, I saw a cartoon the other day. If you can imagine this, it's the maternity ward in the hospital. The babies are all in the cribs, and the relatives are coming in to look at the kids in the cribs, right? And the relatives outside the big window are all talking to one another, and one says, he has his mother's eyes. And the other one says, oh, he has his father's ears. And an aunt says, well, I think his nose looks like the mother. Meanwhile, the kid's in the crib with a thought cloud over his head thinking, gee, I wonder if they have Wi-Fi in here.
Well, that's almost a reality statement. I marvel, and of course the old funny thing for us seniors is that if you don't know how to do something, call your grandkid or call your, they'll show you in a second how to do what you're doing, or they'll get frustrated with you. And
yeah, well, that's not a bad tip. If you have some questions and you're not quite sure, and you have a son or a daughter that is a little more internet savvy than you are, bring them in and talk to them about it.
Well, the internet, like so many things in our world, is a great invention. I think it's a marvelous tool, and has provided, I think, funnily, you know how you'll be sitting in a restaurant and somebody will bring up a subject and everybody doesn't know the answer. 30 seconds later, you've got the answer. You've gone to your cell phone and found the answer. Whereas before, you had to call everybody back a week later and tell them what the answer was, because you had to go get the encyclopedia or whatever to find out the answer.
Yeah, and there's a flip side to that coin. When I was growing up and I had to do a book report, I went to the local library and I pulled out the Encyclopedia Britannica. And that was considered the truth. When we go to the internet now, do you really know where the truth is coming from?
Valid comment. It is a challenge, and you do have to be careful. Yep. And I guess, how would you recommend, again, I'm thinking of anybody, even young children, using the internet and going to websites. How do you try to teach us not to buy into everything you see? In other words, how do we verify that this site is right compared to maybe going to another site?
Well, unfortunately, where it was easy when I was a young kid doing that book report, there was one set of encyclopedia, and that was the truth. Now I'm afraid we have to multi-source to determine that, or at least determine our best guess at what it is. So a lot of things get posted up on the internet or on Facebook that claim this thing or another thing, and so now we've had to go to verification places like Snopes.com or whatever to see if this is a phony post just to influence people and cause them to think in a certain direction. It's unfortunate, but that's part of our way of life now. So it comes down to who do you trust, and that takes some time, patience, and research, and multi-source checking, I'm afraid. I'd like to give you an example of a vulnerability I read up on the other day, and this has to do with the explosion of Wi-Fi. Many people now have Wi-Fi in their homes, and it's a convenience thing. That means you can walk around anywhere in your home with your iPad or your iPhone and plug right in and get that question answered about what the population of Albuquerque is, or the population of Kenya, or whatever it happens to be. And with that comes some risks. There was a story about a year ago about a lady in Indiana who had an unsecured Wi-Fi connection in her home. She's sitting there reading the newspaper, having a cup of coffee in her living room, when bang, a SWAT team enters her home, guns drawn, looking for the killer. What? Who? Where? This lady says. Well, it turns out her next-door neighbor had tapped into her Wi-Fi and was issuing death threats that appeared to be coming from this lady. It took a little while to figure this out, but there's a vivid example of the risk one takes in not ensuring their Wi-Fi connection is protected and secure. True story, happened in Indianapolis, Indiana, if I remember right. I'll double-check that, and I'll talk about it specifically on Saturday.
Okay. Well, and that's the sad thing. You get a wonderful tool like this, and it's like so many things that have been invented throughout history, and there's always somebody out there wanting to use it for the improper use and use it for the wrong way of using it. And then, I mean, you can go with just about anything that's been invented in life. There's always people using them for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, a while back in this discussion, we talked about the Internet of Things, and you, David, you mentioned the Internet of People. This is where I see the evolution going in the future, and it's already started with medical devices. Now, I already talked about the Internet of Things, that is, objects that are connected to the Internet for convenience or for our ability to check on them and see how they're doing. Now let's jump forward a little bit to medical devices. They're becoming more and more sophisticated. People are now starting to wear insulin pumps that have been implanted in their body that, lo and behold, talk to the Internet. There have been tests done, and results have shown that some of these devices are indeed vulnerable. That a person with the means, opportunity, and motive that truly wanted to, quote, do someone in, could cause that pump to malfunction in such a way that it would cause the person to be insulin overloaded, and that could have some pretty serious consequences. Oh, wow. Another example, 1 year ago, a Jeep Cherokee that was connected to the Internet was hacked. And while the driver was driving the car, he suddenly lost control of the car. Stop, start, couldn't control it, couldn't steer it, couldn't speed up or slow down. What are the implications of that? Think about that. Now, since then, the automobile manufacturers have been scrambling to secure these things. But when you think about it, when I talk about the Internet of Things, our computer manufacturers, the Apple people, the Dell people, the Windows people, Windows-based machines, the cell phone makers, they have huge IT staffs that work hard to try and protect these things. Now, sure, there's still holes in some of them, and they require patching, and these things are common. The bad guys are always looking for a way to exploit. As a friend of mine, Dr. Montgomery Scott, says, the more complicated they make the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up the drain. That's a little Star Trek quote for you, but it's true. The point I'm trying to make here is that that as things become more complex, they also become more vulnerable. And I'm just concerned about that, and I'm seeing it happen now, and that's one of the reasons why I was motivated to do this presentation at the library and inform people and hopefully make the Internet a safer place. And besides personal risk, it's a shared risk we bear. One person's vulnerability could affect another person's and make them vulnerable as well. We'll talk more about that.
We have our guest today, Mr. Michael Sayer, who is a retired U.S. Navy officer and has worked in cybersecurity in the federal government and all kinds of places. But you brought up something when we were off the air. Why don't you go into that? We were talking about people in that area.
When I get up in the morning and go out for my morning walk, I run into a lot of walkers in Placitas. People walking dogs, people walking just for exercise. I see more and more cyclists roaming our hills up here. I guess it's a challenge. I'm a cyclist, and I know it's a challenge to do some of the hills here. And that reminded me of something else. There are a lot of tracking devices now that are very popular. Well, let me just say a lot of personal exercise devices that are very popular that you can wear and measure the number of steps you take or the amount of exertion that you're doing, and you can look upon the results after a walk and be satisfied that you did 10,000 steps today. Have you ever asked yourself the question about, well, golly, I can see those results on the internet. How did they get there? Well, does that mean people can track you as you walk? These are things to think about. And from a legal and litigation point of view, who owns that data? Does that Fitbit or whatever you're wearing place you at a certain place and time? Is that legally admissible? Could it be taken as a legal alibi? Well, I know those are all things to think about. And I don't think the courts have made decisions on those sorts of things yet. But something to think about. We all enjoy our physical fitness, but to what extent are we advertising it? And what risks do we bear when we do that?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I used to have a Fitbit, but unfortunately I had some problems with the rash it was giving me, so I don't wear it anymore. But I do have...
That may have been the internet talking to you.
That could be. But I do carry my cell phone with me. Now, I don't actually use it to track me while I'm walking, but I still have it there. And as we've heard on national news, as we've heard many times, that people can get in and track anything you're doing everywhere you're going.
Okay, I just took a look at David's phone, and I see the geolocation services are turned on.
Okay, I don't even know what is that? Where do you see that?
Well, you see that I'm looking at. He has an iPhone here, and I'm looking up on the upper right-hand corner that has the little battery symbol and the percentage on it. I see his Bluetooth is turned off, I think, right now, but I see a little arrow pointing to the northeast, and that tells me his geo services are turned on. And if I wanted to figure out where he was, I would be working on hacking his phone to find that out.
That's a little unnerving. I didn't realize that's what that was. Again, I know a little bit about technology, but this stuff, but not a lot. So it's incredible that they can track you that easy if they wanted to.
Well, there's other trends going on, and they have to do with tracking and personal information. We talked about Fitbit as an example, and I'm not knocking Fitbit. It's a great device. It motivates people to reach exercise goals and stuff, but like everything else that could potentially be connected to the internet, it needs to be used wisely and with the risks in mind. Okay, here Michael predicts... for example, chipping animals is popular now to make sure that there's an RFID in your dog. So if your dog's lost, the dog can be scanned, the owner can be identified and called, and the lost dog can be returned. A lot of talk going around about people being chipped. That medical records could be implanted in that chip and put under the skin along with a lot of personal ID information. You may have heard about credit card skimming or RFID skimming. We even have RFID wallets now that are protected with a shield so you can't be scanned and your information stolen. Well, what about the chip in your body or your future body? Again, wise decisions need to be made, and we'll kick some more of these things around on Saturday.
Wow. Well, again, great technology, great things, but always a risk that has to be addressed, and people finding ways to sneak in and get that information from you, many times unbeknownst to you. And
if they're doing it right, it's unbeknownst to you.
Well, and I think, and you're going to talk here in just a minute, we're going to have to take another quick break. Again, I have to let the world know who we are, but I was reading your article about this eligibility program, program that you conducted for the federal government, for NSA, I believe. You were employed to do it through them. And you discovered while doing this, and I'll just mention it was a mock cyber attack purposely put together for the government to test their own systems. And while you were doing it, you actually discovered that somebody else had hacked into one of the, I don't know if it was Navy or whoever, you discovered that. I'll let you get into that more in just a minute as far as that goes.
Sure.
But that was intriguing to me, that how you were doing that and you actually found something that somebody, and the government themselves, that entity, didn't know that it was going on.
Oh, yep.
Good morning again, and welcome back. We have Michael Sayer here this morning with us, talking about cybersecurity, something that is a very, very important issue for all of us. As we get the wonderful advantages of the internet, unfortunately, there are those out there that like to use it improperly and take advantage and get your personal data. Unless you've been asleep for the last 20 years, you've heard about it all over the news. And unfortunately, lots of people use it to take advantage of you, whether you're a senior citizen, a young person. We were talking about children and how they're vulnerable. So he's going to be at the library from 2 to 4 this Saturday at our Placitas Library on Highway 165. Please get over there and hear his full presentation. He's been giving you tips. But I'm going to ask him to sort of close out today on a subject. I was reading the background information from him, and he was involved in a program that the federal government wanted him to do, and it was through the NSA. They wanted to check, and correct me if I'm wrong, they wanted to check how vulnerable our military services were. And I believe it was directed at the military services to see if they were really cyber protected. And Michael was given the privilege of being the lead on the team that did this test cyber attack, I guess you might call it. So, Michael, tell us more about detail about that and sort of where that went and what you found out.
Well, let's see. First off, we were chatting over the break. My wife, who's my conscience, reminded me that I might be coming off as a bit paranoid with respect to the internet. And if I've left that impression with you, I guess I'm 49% not paranoid and 51% yes. It's just, it's so common now, and we tend to ignore it, and that's what scares me. I just think we need to put wisdom along with what we're doing. So no need to be frightened, no need to shut your computer down and never use it again. As Davis pointed out, it's a miracle invention that we're able to reach around the world, talk about things with one another, and share information and retrieve information and educate ourselves. But again, it needs to be used wisely. Okay, to answer your question, eligible receiver. The eligible receiver program is an ongoing program that the Department of Defense uses. It's called the No Notice Interoperability Exercise Program. It's run by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to make sure that all the branches of our military are working with one another. And there are different themes for those exercises. And in 1997, and this shows how old I am, I'm older than Dave, I think. Anyway, in 1997, the theme was cybersecurity. And it was the first large-scale exercise designed to test our ability to respond to an attack on the U.S. information infrastructure. So when I say the information infrastructure, what does that mean? Well, electricity, water, financial and banking, communications, transportation, those are examples of our national information infrastructure. And it was also designed to do a real-live test against our defense information systems. This took a lot. It was a dubious distinction to be the leader of the, quote, red team that led the attack on these things. But it took a lot of coordination work, a lot of policy and legal work to make sure every step of the way was done with full legal authority and safe. But it had two phases. One was a simulated, not real, simulated attack on that information infrastructure, power, communications, banking, and so on. And the red team, the adversaries that were set up for this attack that I had the opportunity to lead, was set up as a simulated adversary that wanted to wreak havoc with the United States in order to further their own national and political objectives. So that Phase 1 simulated attack on the national infrastructure was designed to cause public pressure for action. That is, when the lights go out, people are going to start theoretically panicking and calling the government to say, hey, put it back on. What's going on here? It was simulated, but it was based on actual vulnerabilities that had been discovered in our infrastructure, proven in a laboratory environment, and then scripted into the exercise. Phase 2 was an actual attack. That is, really using the internet to target key defense information systems. To be quite blunt, we won. We won in
not sure you wanted to have that happen, actually.
No, it was actually a surprise as to the extent in which we were able to attack the information infrastructure and exploit vulnerabilities of the system to the extent that we had done. Again, I'll talk about more details about this when we have the meeting in the library. But the lessons learned from that turned into a presidential commission on how to protect the information infrastructure. And I have been documented. If you want to read about it, Dark Territory, which is a book written by author Fred Kaplan, has a pretty good summary of the exercise in there. And you can also search on the internet and you'll find out things about it. It was eye-opening, and at that time, this is 1997 now, so it's 20-something years in the making. Now that exercise is being referred to as the cyber awakening in the U.S. government by many senior DOD and U.S. government officials. It was sort of a wake-up call, an alarm clock of, hey, this is important, we need to start doing things about it.
Well, that's very interesting, and as you all will learn, and he'll give you more detail on Saturday. But I was just very, very interested in how that would work, and he talks about they had to legally be sure everything was safe. You know, you had all the. I remember in an article you had various attorneys involved from the various departments to be sure everything was up and up, but done so we could prove whether we were secure or not secure.
Oh yeah, we had I had lawyers all over the team and me to make sure that we followed all the rules. And the interesting thing about that is no hacker would be subject to those constraints. We had our hands, frankly, tied behind our backs in what we could do with the most common exploitation tools that anybody can get on the internet. Nothing sophisticated, nothing really specifically designed for this. This is we did our attacks with tools that anyone could get. And again, real hackers don't have to obey the law.
Sure.
And our hands were pretty well tied, and yet we were able to demonstrate quite clearly the vulnerabilities. Now, often I get the question, well, are things better now? And I'd say across the board, yes, they are. The government has taken a lot of steps to secure both the critical infrastructures and our DoD information systems. On the flip side of the coin, the bad guys have gotten better too. So it's a constant struggle being waged in the ether, and it's, it was an interesting career. I'm glad I'm retired in Placitas.
Well, we're certainly glad to have you here this morning, and it has been a great conversation. Folks, I want you all to be aware that Saturday at the Placitas Library, 2 to 4 p.m., Michael will be there and his wife, and he will be talking about, in much more detail, he just sort of gave you the headlines, as it were, today, much more detail about the cybersecurity issues of owning and having this technology in your life. Go ahead.
I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to come on your show, David. And thank you to the Placitas Community Library for hosting this Saturday. And I'd just like to mention that Veterans Day is tomorrow.
Yes.
I'd like to say a big thank you to all the veterans out there who have helped make this country safe. Thank you for your service.
Well,